Who was Jesus? Is he a historical character? Who wrote the Gospels? Why are they written in Greek? Why did they have a pro-Roman perspective? Why was the religion headquartered in Rome? Those were the mysteries that I saw about the Gospels.
The origin of the Christian religion has been a subject steeped in mystery for nearly 2,000 years. Joseph Atwell is one of a number of scholars today from all around the world who are questioning the historic facts behind these ancient mysteries. When examining the actual history of this era, many of the answers provided by the Church and Christian scholars do not hold up to rigorous scrutiny.
This is really important for our culture, to understand where Christianity came from.
No doubt Christians have done a lot of good for the world, but then there are other Christians, often the most dogmatic, who create wars, hatred, and other harm under the disguise of religion. In studying how Christianity emerged, many of our scholars agree that it was used as a political tool to control the masses of the day, and it is still being used this way today.
The problem is that Christianity has been used as a tool by government that uses the goodness in people against them. For example, support for the wars in the Middle East has been preached to evangelical Christians as a way to speed up the end of days. This is just one example of the way that propaganda is used to control and manipulate the populace. Actually, according to my study of the ancient texts, the second coming of the Christ has already occurred.
Maybe we need to expand the possible answers about how Christianity originated, and deeper questions need to be asked. Maybe we need to examine what political motives were behind the formation of the Christian religion.
I think it's a requirement of alert citizens to know how the Gospels were written, why they were written, who produced them, what was the purpose and back of all this. This is good citizenry. Everyone should be involved in this.
Today, we live on the brink of an immense paradigm shift, and this modern time is very parallel to the era in which Christianity emerged. Studying this ancient era can give us the perspective needed for coming up with solutions to today's problems and for helping create the better world that we envision.
And the penny dropped that Jesus, as a human being, never existed.
The presentation of the Jesus character, it's somewhat of a composite of many messianic leaders of the time.
Well, let's just go back to the drawing board and we'll leave aside all of the assumptions of Christian history and let's just look at the text afresh and consider every possibility. Let's open the whole game up.
Can you think that Christianity is really paganism by a different name? Now it feels completely obvious.
Some of us are saying that this was a sun god turned into a Jewish man.
In all of this, we're dealing with literature. We're not dealing with history. So the answer is no, there is no history to this character of Jesus. It's entirely a literary creation.
Some of our Bible scholars are mavericks, working outside the restrictions of mainstream religious institutions. This allows them the freedom to provide fresh insights and draw some startling conclusions about how Christianity was formed.
I began reading a number of books on the subject. This turned into a decade-long research.
For Joseph Atwill, the key was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only Jewish literature ever discovered from the 1st century AD or CE, the time that Jesus would have been preaching among the Jews.
The characters in the Dead Sea Scrolls were militaristic, and you could see that this movement wanted to push the foreigners out of Israel. They were fundamentalists, whereas the characters in the Gospel are different. They are pacifistic. They are turning the other cheek. They're giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. How did a movement like Christianity come to exist in a region that was occupied by Roman soldiers and had Jewish zealots within it that were going to push these Romans out? How was that possible? I began studying the other two major works of the era, the New Testament and Wars of the Jews by Josephus, a Roman court historian who described the war between the Romans and the Jews in the 1st century. While reading these works side by side, I noticed an amazing connection between them. Certain events from the ministry of Jesus seemed to closely parallel episodes from the military campaign of Roman Caesar Titus Flavius, a campaign which took place 40 years after Jesus supposedly lived. My efforts to understand these connections led me to an incredible discovery. Christianity had been invented by a little-known family of Roman Caesars, the Flavians, and they left us documents to prove it.
The Flavians are not a household name, and yet it's the Flavians who completely reshaped the Roman Empire. In Rome, of course, there's the Colosseum, which is understood to be the best-known monument of the ancient Roman Empire, perhaps. The Colosseum is, in fact, a Flavian construction produced during the Flavian period. It's under the Flavians that both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity take shape.
Why would the Flavians be interested in creating religions? Much like today, their era was marked by political power struggles, a bankrupt economy, religious conflicts, and endless wars. In the midst of this turmoil, the Flavians seized control of the Roman Empire and ushered in an immense paradigm shift. To understand the Flavians' rise to power, we need to go back to the reign of the previous powerful rulers, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Beginning with Julius Caesar in the year 49 BCE, the Julio-Claudians ruled Rome for over 100 years, transforming the government from a republic into an empire. This family contained all the famous Caesars: Julius, who predated the time of Jesus; Augustus, who was Caesar at the time of Jesus' supposed birth; Tiberius, who ruled during Jesus' supposed death, followed by the infamous Caligula; then Claudius, and ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty with Nero, whose reign begins in 54 CE.
The Julio-Claudians enjoyed a godlike status until the family degenerated and began to damage the Roman Empire.
By the time of Nero, his famous decadence was bankrupting the empire, and the Jews of Judea were staging a huge rebellion against their Roman rulers.
Judea was one of the many conquered provinces that made up the Roman Empire. This region, which was also known as Palestine, was controlled by a family that served as Rome's tax collector, the Herods.
They were a Greco-Arab family, somewhat possibly Judaized, though only Judaized when it was convenient to please the subjects they were given, who were put in power in Palestine and destroyed the previous Jewish ruling family, the Maccabean family, root and stalk.
Besides being heavily taxed and ruled by a non-Jewish family put in power by Rome, the Jews were further inflamed by the requirement that a statue of the Caesar be placed for worship in every temple throughout the empire.
In the Roman Empire, you could pretty much have any god you want But legally, you had to submit to the emperor as a god as well. You had to at least acknowledge that the Roman leader was also a divine figure. But the Jews would not have any of it.
It's fundamental to Jewish belief that you shall make no graven images. It's one of the commandments given at Sinai by God. So the Jews never made representations of God.
The Jews had a very different type of religion. They had a religion which was much more focused on the book and less focused upon cultic statues. This presented a real problem for the Romans. They tried to install statues of Caesar, but the Jews weren't going to buy that at all. In fact, it aggravated them. It enraged them. And the Romans really, I think, didn't understand this. It's not statues, it's books.
And those books contained what are known as the Jewish Messianic prophecies.
The thing that most moved the Jews' revolt against Rome was an obscure prophecy from among their writings that a world ruler would come out of Palestine.
Holy books inspired the Jews to expect a redeemer who would redeem Israel, rescue Israel, restore Israel to power and leadership in the world.
The Messiah that the literature described was a warrior. The Messiahs would have claimed the same attributes that David did. David could overcome any army because God gave him the power to do it. If you had the power of God, you could easily defeat the Roman army. The people rebelled against Rome and were led by a messianic movement that had a series of messiahs that had come forward to fight against the Roman Empire.
The Hebrew word Messiah is translated into Greek as Christos, or Christ, so the title of Christ can describe any of the numerous messiahs of this movement.
Yes, the word Christ or Christians can refer to the Palestine Messianic movement, but it's a later term. It's a later reformulation of the Messianic movement in Palestine.
This movement rebels against Rome in 66 and is successful. It actually defeats them militarily, so it must have been a huge movement. The victorious Jews set up a nation state directly in the Roman Empire.
And the Romans had to do something about it. There was a real danger that this Messianic movement could not only boil over in Judea itself, but could spread to other Jewish communities and other parts of the Roman Empire.
Rome ruled its colonies with a rod of iron, and any resistance was going to be met with brute force.
At this time during Nero's reign, two of the finest military men in the empire were the Flavians, Vespasian and his son Titus.
Vespasian and Titus were military men. They spent a great deal of their life outside of Rome. For over a decade, they had waged war against the Druids in Brittany and Gaul. Vespasian and Titus were successful in essentially destroying the Druids. They left behind no historical record of their existence.
And it's the Flavians that Nero calls upon when he needs to suppress the Jews' rebellion in Judea.
Nero responded by asking his best general, Vespasian, and his son Titus to go into Judea with a huge army, 70,000 troops, and a similar number of support individuals. So they meant business. The Romans came down to crush the rebellion.
In the year 66 CE, the Flavians begin their military campaign against the Jews. They start further north in Galilee, where the first of three key events takes place. They destroy the Jewish towns of Galilee. They also capture a Jewish rebel who later becomes a critical figure in the formulation of Christianity.
This is where they captured one of the leaders of the rebellion, a Jew named Josephus Bar Matthias. Now, Josephus presented himself to the Flavians as a prophet.
He survived. He survived apparently by telling Vespasian that the prophecies of the Jews pointed out that Vespasian would become emperor. And of course he did, so Vespasian quite liked Josephus. He used him as a translator in his entourage. He used him to appeal to the rebels to surrender.
At this point, Josephus became a turncoat, and worked with the Flavians against the rebellion.
Meanwhile, chaos is increasing back in Rome, where Nero's rule is being threatened.
In the year 68, the Senate found the courage to depose Nero and he committed suicide. Now, in that circumstance, Vespasian was a prime candidate to become emperor.
In the middle of this war, Vespasian returned to Rome and seized the throne. The Flavians then became the imperial family.
With Vespasian becoming the new Caesar in Rome, Titus stays behind on the battlefield and sets his sights on Jerusalem, where the other two key events take place. Titus encircles Jerusalem with a wall, and finally he razes the temple, leaving not one stone atop another.
It took a while. They eventually had to bring on starvation by building a wall, a barricade entirely enveloping the city.
What happens, of course, is the temple in 70 is completely destroyed.
For the Jews, it was the ultimate calamity because, of course, this was the house of their God and it was destroyed by the Romans quite thoroughly. Titus, of course, was the victor of this great siege. Titus carried the spoils of this captured city back to Rome for his triumph. He took the treasures of the temple, their famous 7-branch candlestick. You can see it on the Arch of Titus in Rome. It celebrates that tremendous victory of Rome again triumphant, and Titus, of course, is the hero of the day.
All of the artifacts from the temple that they seized, they put on public display in what they refer to as the Palace of Peace, except for one item. The Jewish scripture, Josephus records that the Flavians took and placed in their private palace where no one was allowed to see it.
Although Titus Flavius successfully ended the rebellion in Judea, another rebellion soon broke out in Alexandria, Egypt. The Flavians were clear that this was not the end of the Jewish Messianic movement. They also recognized that it was the Jews' Messianic literature that was fueling this movement. So once they captured the Jewish scripture, they had all other copies of it destroyed.
And that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls had to have been buried in a cave, because that was the only way they could be safe from the Roman destruction. There was not a single scrap of literature found from the Messianic movement until the scrolls were discovered. That's why they're such a treasure, because they're the only real voice of the Messianic movement that we have.
And the real voice of the Jews' Messianic movement, according to our scholars, was violent and militaristic, not the pacifistic version depicted in the Gospels.
War against Rome was a Messianic war. So that's why I say that the scrolls are not only the literature of the Messianic movement in Palestine, they're also the literature of the war against Rome.
The Romans needed to subdue the Jews' religion, so they set about influencing it and changing it.
They realize they can't destroy the Jewish religion altogether. That's not their objective. They realize they're sensible enough to realize that they can't do that. So what you have to do is try to create a type of Judaism that is benign. And it's exactly coinciding with the rise of the Flavian dynasty is the arrival of two benign forms of Jewish ideology.
It's during this period that a new literature enters history, which describes a peace-loving, turn-the-other-cheek preaching Jewish Messiah named Jesus Christ. But if the Flavians wrote the Gospels, how could a Roman family know how to write Jewish literature that refers to Jewish prophecy? The answer lies in the Flavians' collaborations with a number of Jewish intellectuals, beginning with their own court historian, Josephus.
Josephus arrives back in Rome with Titus. He becomes an adopted member of the Flavian family. An amazing turn of events for the Jewish turncoat. He becomes Flavius Josephus. Josephus at this time begins writing the history of the war. And he records that Titus gave him the Jewish scripture. Josephus's histories have always been associated with the origins of Christianity.
Time and again you can find parallels between what Josephus writes and what turns up in the Gospels. It's a powerful evidence of their true origin.
In reading the works of Josephus side by side with the Gospels, scholars have noticed parallels between the two works. It appears as though the history of Josephus records events that fulfill the prophecies of the Old and New Testaments. Early Christians understood this connection. In fact, when the Bible first began to be printed in the Middle Ages, it included the history of Josephus.
He was employed to write the official history that we have. The other histories from this period have been destroyed ruthlessly by the Romans. Josephus tells us this in very chilling passages, how the Romans exerted complete control of the literature of this period. There were alternative histories of the Jewish war written. Well, the Romans rounded up the writers of those histories and executed them. They rounded up all the copies of those histories and destroyed them. That is to say, they ruthlessly wiped out any alternative history, so that the only history we have is written by Josephus. And let's remember who Josephus was.
Chief propagandist of the Flavian dynasty, and he was very, very successful. He moved back to Rome. He was given an apartment in the emperor's own townhouse, and he was appointed the chronicler of the Roman Jewish War, using Vespasian's own diaries of the events.
Also in the pages of his history, Josephus declares that the Jews' Messiah or Christ is none other than Flavius Vespasian and his dynastic family.
To put it succinctly, Josephus says that there was a prophecy that a world ruler would come out of Palestine. The Jews thought this applied to one of their own. They were wrong in their interpretations. He used the most cynical interpretation. He applied it to the rise of the Roman emperor in Palestine.
Josephus recorded that the Messianic prophecies foresaw not a Jew, but Vespasian and his dynasty. In fact, all of the Flavian historians recorded that the Flavian Caesar was the Christ.
It was important to the Flavians that they be seen as the Christ, as divine and godlike, and this was not mere vanity. The Julio-Claudians before them had already established that presenting themselves as gods was a powerful tool in controlling their subjects. When the Flavians took over the throne, they inherited an enormous bureaucracy that was already in place, the imperial cult, which was dedicated to promoting the idea of Caesar as a god.
Another part of the puzzle is the Roman imperial cult. Why is it important? Well, because it coincides with that same period of time as the emergence of the Christ cult.
You had a whole social community. The whole social structure of these conquered territories was governed by the imperial cult. And if you wanted to succeed, the key social community to join was the imperial cult, because that's where all the movers and shakers were.
This idea of the emperor becoming an object of worship was well established in the Roman system before Vespasian and Titus came along. It was prevalent in all major centres. It had its own priesthood. There was a ceremony, an annual celebration, annual games for the imperial cult. Now, it had many characteristics which would later colour the Christian cult. It grew in the same centres. It made claims that were later transferred to Christ.
The Julio-Claudians had claimed that they were of divine descent and that they were therefore legitimate. Their power base was the Roman aristocracy, the Roman nobility. All of that collapsed into this power vacuum. Vespasian was declared emperor by the troops, by the Roman army. So effectively, it was a military coup. With the change of dynasty, they have to create a whole mythology to legitimize that dynasty. At the same time, they're creating a whole mythology to counter Jewish messianism. Somewhere along the line, those two things get mixed together.
When Vespasian died, Titus began the process of having his father deified. This is a complicated process because only the Roman Senate can bestow on an individual the title of deus or God. Titus came to the Senate and presented evidence that the life of his father had been divine. Certainly this would have included the military campaign that the Flavians waged through Judea. And it's at this time I think the Gospels were written, because the theological structure in the Gospels of a God the Father and the Son of God is the same one that Titus would have been presenting to the Roman Senate. Well, the Roman Senate did accept Titus's evidence, and Vespasian was deified and became a god. Titus therefore became a son of God.
The Arch of Titus that still stands in modern Rome today is inscribed with a dedication to the divine Titus, son of the divine Vespasian, or son of a god. This imperial cult, set up to worship Caesar as god, also provided the basis for the structure of the Roman Catholic Church.
Now, the rituals, paraphernalia and symbols of paganism were transferred wholesale to the Christian church. The most obvious and clear example is where the title of the pagan chief priest of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, became the title of the Pope, the Christian Pope. If you look at who held the original bishop positions in the Catholic Church in those early times, you will see that they are members of the same pagan aristocracy. They simply changed their clothing a little bit. They wore the same garments, but they wore slightly different headdresses. They had become from being a priest of a pagan cult to being a priest of Rome.
Where the Vatican now stands, there was once a pagan temple which celebrated the mysteries of a dying and resurrecting God-man who wasn't Jesus. There are many churches in Rome, I've been to a few, where you go above into the church and there is Jesus, and you go underneath and there's a little sanctuary of Mithras, and it's basically the same figure.
So the Roman plot to invent Christianity is just so clever when you think about it. Through the Pope, who is God's representative on earth, they no longer needed expensive standing armies, wars, and punishment of disobedient peasants. They could, through religion, rule their subjects.
Over time, Roman Christianity propagated throughout the empire by way of the mass media of the day, the Roman roads. The Romans must have approved of this new religion because, as some scholars ask, if the Gospels really were Jewish literature about a Roman sentenced criminal, why wouldn't they have been destroyed?
One of the really surprising things for me was to realize the extent of Roman control of propaganda and of literature. So that when you suddenly get all of this Christian literature arising in this period, one has to ask, well, how did that happen? The conclusion that one has to reach is that that could not have happened without some degree of complicity on the part of the Romans, so that one is led to the conclusion that the Romans must be involved in the production of this literature.
To produce and disseminate this literature was a huge undertaking, and the Flavians undoubtedly had collaborators. We know they were funded by the wealthiest family in the world at this time, the Alexanders, a Jewish family who served as Rome's tax collectors in Egypt. Like the Herods in Judea, the Alexanders had strong motivation to keep the Jews' messianic movement from threatening their position and their wealth. One of their family members was Philo of Alexandria, a famous Jewish theologian who was already writing works that combined Jewish beliefs with the modern Greek and Roman pagan beliefs of the day. Many scholars agree that his writings form the basis for much of the philosophy of Christianity.
In these pages is practically every concept that you can find within Christianity. He combined Greek philosophy, And he took that and he combined it with Judaism. On top of that, he was from an extremely wealthy family. And this is important because you have to follow the money when you're looking at major trends, new paradigms being set. And if you look at his family, then you start seeing, well, this is interesting because now we're starting to come across the Flavians again. His relatives were very involved with the Flavians. That whole area is where we want to look very closely for the Christian origins.
It's from exactly this same circle of people that you get the first signs of Christian ideology, and they all lead to the rise of the Flavian dynasty.
Another wealthy, influential character, Princess Bernice, was from the Herod family in Judea. She's the granddaughter of Herod the Great, a product of the Herods' intermarriage with the conquered Jewish ruling Messianic lineage.
Princess Bernice appears in the New Testament, which makes her an interesting character. She had 2 or 3 husbands and then became the mistress of Titus. So you can see this again, rather like dynasty here. You know, powerful people, mixed marriages, you know, shacking up with the conqueror. Yeah, and it's really where Joe Atwill takes his idea of a conspiracy to write the New Testament. But let him say it in his own words.
Bernice was a Herod related by marriage to the Alexanders, and of course later she became the mistress to Titus. The fact that she was so closely linked with the Flavians shows you that the 3 families were very unified in financial, romantic, and likely theological issues.
By the looks of things, this coalescence seemed to have brought about a dynamic that led to the synthesis of Judaism and paganism and eventually became Christianity. So this is a very key time period.
I believe that the Gospels were actually written under the control of the Herods, the Alexanders, and the Flavians. These families had the motivation to create Christianity, and with the expertise in Judaism that the Alexanders and the Herods had, they had the actual technical ability to come up with these stories that are fulfillment of Hebraic prophecies.
So it seems the Flavians had the motivation, the means, and the collaborations through which they likely constructed and began disseminating Christianity. And if our scholars are correct, one of the documents they left behind are the Gospels themselves.
I began working on the study of the Gospels in the 1970s, and I look at texts in terms of how were these composed, what does understanding their structure tell you about who wrote them and why they were written. These texts were not independent Jewish texts, but they were created as literary works using classical literary models.
If we expect that this is the testimony of witnesses, we've got a major problem. We actually have 4 anonymous documents. They were not written by the named people on those documents. This is simply church tradition that the Gospels are so named according to Mark, according to Matthew. So this idea that the Gospels are reliable testimony is patent nonsense.
Why are the Gospels called Gospels? That's a critical question. The word gospel in Greek is evangelion, and it means good news of military victory. Whose military victory are we celebrating here in these Gospels? Well, it seems to me that we are celebrating clearly the Roman military victory, because these events, the Battle of Gadara, the Battle of the Lake of Galilee, the successful Battle of Jerusalem, these are battles that the Romans won. Why are the Gospels celebrating battles that the Jews lost, if these things were written by the Jews?
The fact that the Gospels are known to us in Greek and not in Aramaic or Hebrew is, I think, just evidence of their authorship. They were not written by any followers of Jesus who would have surely spoken Aramaic, and if they had been fishermen and simple folk, they would not have had the literal skills to write them anyway.
If we look closely, there actually are clues in the Gospels that point to who the true authors were.
A lot of the Christian literature advocates turning away from the Jewish law and obeying Roman law. Well, this fits perfectly into Roman propaganda purposes. And then you have, in general, the portrayal of Jesus as the peaceful Jew who is wandering around in what is depicted as a sort of a pastoral scenes, talking to fishermen and farmers and so forth, when in fact, this is a war zone. Judea is a war zone. And you ask yourself, well, why is it not portrayed as a war zone?
I mean, they really had it down pat. They have Jesus saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is basically in response to talking about money. Whose benefit would that be? It's so blatantly obvious.
The perception of Roman characters in the Gospels, they're all interpreted in a favourable light. They are pro-Roman. They do not depict the Romans as the forces of evil. They reverse that. It's the Jews who become the forces of darkness. It's very striking that various passages in the Gospels refer to the Jews as some people separate from the heroes of Jesus and his disciples. The Jews are those who object. The Jews are those who try to thwart the divine plan. Now, that gives us a clue, certainly, to who were the true authors of this book.
They are works of literature created by people who are trained in Jewish literature, but whose values are pro-Roman.
The Romans wanted to promote anti-Semitism, and so they arranged the story of the beloved man God, Jesus Christ, to appear as if the Jews had brought about his death. Because of this, the Jews would have to suffer anti-Semitism throughout history.
So this was a piece of work that could not have been done except by a fairly established literary team, such as the literary team that was in Rome actually writing the books of Josephus. I mean, that was written by a literary team, and it was written as one of the attempts to give prominence to the Flavian Caesars, which the Gospels also do. So it is extremely likely that the Gospels, as a form of epic, designed to magnify allegorically the Roman Caesars, is also written at the court of the Flavian emperors.
But the Jesus story takes place many decades before the Flavians came to power. Why would the Flavians create a work about a Jewish Messiah that wasn't even from their own era?
The Gospels were very precisely backdated 40 years. Jesus' ministry was started in 30 CE, exactly 40 years from the destruction of the temple. His ministry ends at Passover, 33 CE, which is 40 years before the end of the Jewish-Roman War, which occurred at Passover in 73 CE with the famous Battle of Masada.
The Gospels are backdated into the period of Pontius Pilate. That is to say, before the First Jewish War, which is to say, in the Julio-Claudian period. But this is typical of Flavian literature. It's a Flavian technique. What they do is they backdate this story into the period of their enemies, namely the Julio-Claudians. And so, generation after generation of Christian scholar and even secular historians go hunting in the Julio-Claudian period for the origins of the Gospels. They don't really find any answers there. There are allusions in the Gospels to the destruction of the temple. The most reasonable answer to that is that these texts were written after the destruction of the temple. That is to say, in the Flavian period, after the change of dynasty.
This backdating of the story of Jesus Christ, 40 years earlier from the time the Gospels may actually have been written, explains why many of the prophecies of Jesus came true within exactly 40 years.
What does this all add up to? In my view, the thing that is most significant is the research by Joseph Atwell in his book Caesar's Messiah, which suggests that the Gospels were actually created as works of Roman propaganda at the end of the Roman-Jewish War under the reign of the Flavian emperors, that is Titus Caesar and Vespasian Caesar. And if you end up worshipping Jesus, what you will really end up doing is worshipping Caesar in disguise.
This may have been how the Flavians finally got the Jews to worship Caesar as a god, by giving them Jesus Christ, a Messiah more to the Romans' liking. But is there any actual history to this character? Where did he really come from?